Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion. I'm Allison McCauley, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion where we're going to be diving deep into the very important topic of data migration in today's landscape. So we're going to have a compelling discussion ahead. I'm going to be interviewing an expert from Precisely, who I'll be introducing in a moment. And he's going to share his insights on the complexities and the opportunities of migrating data across all the various environments that we have today as organizations are increasingly looking to leverage cloud. Some of the topics that we're going to be exploring today include current trends in cloud migration, ensuring data integrity. We're going to talk about choosing the right partnerships and how to approach that, and exploring basic strategic approaches and the trade-offs. I'd like to welcome John de Saint-Phal to stage. He is a leader in Precisely's product management team. He is an expert in data replication solutions. He specializes in legacy systems, IBM infrastructure, and John has a long history of helping enterprises to integrate disparate data technologies with modern cloud systems. So I'd like to welcome John to stage, and hoping that he can come on and tell us a little bit more about work in his area.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the intro, and hopefully I can live up to that kind of introduction. So yeah, again, thank you so much for having me. My name is John de Saint-Phal, and mainly coming from the data integration space where I've worked for a number of years, again, helping integrate various systems that all kind of come with their own complexity. You know, I think we're going through a very unique time right now where a lot of organizations are looking to modernize their IT stack in ways maybe they haven't over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And so it's fun, you know, you get to interact with a lot of interesting people trying to accomplish a lot that kind of makes this world go round. You help them solve problems and kind of figure out how these different technologies fit together to create value. So it's kind of what I've been up to, for the last several years at Precisely.
So I'm super excited to jump in, and you talked about what's happening in this moment, and that's where I want to dive in first. Is I want to get your perspective on this particular moment. Like, what is the impetus for data migration right now? Why is this a growing priority for organizations? Why is this something that we're discussing today, and it's so important to discuss today? Could you help us? Could you give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the world we sit in today is kind of the confluence of a number of different things coming together. I mean, I always think about the before, middle, and after. So if I think about, what's sort of ending as we're, in the midst of this cloud migration, we're still feeling kind of some of the long tail effects of, the lockdown period and some of the transitions that we experienced, I think, during the heart of 2020 and onward. A lot of people changed their buying patterns. They changed their behavior. Anecdotally, I can say I started buying groceries online that I usually, went to the store for. So that's one example of something that I did then that now I continue to do, even though, much has returned to normal. So that's, a microcosm of a lot of things that are going on right now. People are changing how they're looking to engage with businesses. And so a lot of the projects we saw kind of ramp up during the heart of the pandemic are really coming to a conclusion or coming to fruition. And it's kind of what's next, right? How do we continue to build on this for the next wave of challenges? And so I think where we sit today, we're in the midst of some volatile market conditions, right? There are a lot of unpredictable things that are going on around the world. And people are really trying to deliver services and provide aspects of their business at a lower cost. Are there ways that we can streamline costs to make things more efficient while also creating kind of new goods and services? So I think that's a little bit of where the appetite for the cloud comes in. And then I think the last thing I'll sort of sprinkle on that is, we're seeing this ever evolving kind of regulatory and privacy environment around the world that's becoming more and more important. And so I think being able to kind of standardize on a lot of these upcoming or forthcoming regulatory requirements, things around security or heightened InfoSec policies, that's also leading people to embrace some of these cloud principles to help them standardize across their organization. So A little bit of a long-winded answer, but certainly kind of a big topic to cover. So
Well,
hopefully that
actually,
makes sense.
it sets it up perfectly because there's so many things that I want to dive into that you just mentioned. Maybe I'll start with what you mentioned last about regulatory shifts and changes and a new bar for that and privacy as well. Can you help us just sort of understand how data migration can support that kind of standardization and sort of connect those a little more strongly for us so we can understand that better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. Again, I work in the product management space at Precisely, and so I talk to a lot of customers, and they tell me, what they're missing and all their hopes, dreams, and desires. And I think a lot of what I'm seeing is sort of a standardization across authenticating to various systems, as an example. So let's say, I'm an AWS shop. I want all of my applications to use certain authentication practices across the board so I can write data to AWS. I think you're seeing various customers adopt kind of open standards, so things like open authentications across the board. And then I'm also seeing a lot of organizations sort of standardize on one cloud provider and embrace a lot of the different security offerings that they bring to market. And I think also there's sort of this arms race to an extent with everything in IT, but because IT security is so top of mind, I think a lot of cloud providers are looking for new ways that they can enhance what they have today or build on, additional visibility into security, things like that. But I guess if I had to pin it down to one thing with respect to data integration, I would say it's all around accessing certain systems, validating your identity, and making sure that how you're doing that kind of aligns with industry standard policies or corporate policies or whatever the latest thing is. And these things tend to evolve very rapidly, so there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, in a way, it feels that what you're speaking about is this is just sort of essential foundation to be able to respond to the movement in today's environment that happens so quickly. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I think more and more, if it wasn't already true, the people who run kind of information security, IT security, really have the keys to the kingdom nowadays. They can stop your project in its tracks if it doesn't meet their requirements. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of part of the nature of the world today, and it's certainly only going to evolve and grow, and it'll be interesting to kind of watch.
So I want to zoom out a little bit to center us in when you think of overall business goals. So if I'm looking to make a business case for work in this area, what are the business goals that I should be looking at that really are driving data migration to the cloud? You've mentioned earlier when we first started talking, you mentioned cost control as one. But how do you think about holistically, how should we be thinking about the business goals that are really the impetus for making this move?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it all boils down to revenue at the end of the day, whether you're reducing costs to improve revenue or whether you're delivering new goods and services to drive revenue, right? So I work with a lot of organizations that want to, from a management perspective, sunset some of the technologies that they have within their data centers. They don't want to manage them. It's too expensive. They can't find the right skills. So there's kind of this manpower cost they have associated with it. They need highly specialized individuals to run these systems, whereas, a lot of the cloud technologies are written in languages or use kind of frameworks that they teach in colleges around the world. So I think you're looking at a certain set of people that are trying to move away from older, more expensive systems to newer technologies that are more ubiquitous and familiar to kind of the general, population of the workforce. And so that's one respect. I think people trying to sunset and save on operational costs or what they foresee as drastically growing operational costs associated with some of these systems over time. So that's part of it. But I think the other side of the coin is more around what are new kind of nice or popular or snazzy or attractive features that we can bring into our applications to start to kind of edge out our competition. And I think this is where you see everybody focused on data science and AI and new customer experiences, because, I've used this phrase before. It's kind of like this arms race, right? Where you have everybody trying to deliver this new distinct experience. And a lot of times, if you want to deliver a new feature very quickly, you want to use whatever the latest AI tooling is, you want to use whatever the latest data technology is, you have to have that data available in the cloud. And so that's kind of this other big push in, we want to use all these nice, shiny new tools, but we need to make our data available for it. And they live kind of over here in this cloud ecosystem. So I think that's kind of the other side of it, right? People sunsetting systems, people trying to take advantage of new technologies. And then there's kind of this hybrid world, right? Where I maybe like this system that sits on premises, but I need the data. And so, I can let this system manage my transactions, but I need to periodically bring that data over to the cloud because I need to analyze it or, make it available in some way. So I think there are a lot of very nuanced business motivations that we could probably delve into, but I think that's kind of a large umbrella, couple of examples that I can kind of bring to the forefront.
There's this undercurrent of the examples that you gave that just speaks to agility and our ability to move so quickly in this future is that it feels like so many of those are helping to promote that, to create a agile foundation.
Yeah, and I think, this is the whole promise of the cloud, right? The reason why companies like AWS kind of revolutionized the world of IT is because, it used to take weeks to provision a server, right? I want a new Linux environment. I need to maybe procure a new server. I need to install it in my data center. I need to make sure that from a physical maintenance, like cooling and heating perspective, all that stuff is working. Now, with AWS, and when they first kind of really took the market by storm, you could click a button and you had your instance, right? And so I think that's what we're seeing more and more is everybody wants to make these services available as easily as possible. And there's certainly a monetary incentive for vendors that can provide access to a system very easily. And users can go off and kind of play with it and create their own value and present it to their own internal teams. So, it's very much the speed of the world we live in today. And, we as consumers recognize that, right? We want everything now. We're all over new features and they become the latest meme and trend. And then it kind of moves in the cycle. So absolutely, that's just the nature of the beast, I think, as I'd look at it.
So I'm hoping that you could paint a picture for us of, if I've done a fantastic job of really migrating my data to the cloud across my business, what new possible does this unlock? And I'm hoping maybe you could give us some examples, maybe organizations you've worked with and talk to, what is different? What is now possible for them? How has this work made a difference for them? Could you give us, just bring it to life for us a little bit more?
Yeah. So, I think there are a couple different ways that you can look at this, right? So from a revenue standpoint, that's probably the most basic one, right? I have a new application that requires data that I'm trying to stand up. Can I bring that to market? Can I engage with customers? Can I use that to drive revenue? Right. So I think that's one way to look at it. And that's how I think most shareholders and boards and things tend to look at it, right? What's the bottom line that I'm driving? But there's also kind of this general sentiment, I think, that you find across the C-suite, large enterprises around the world, where you'll talk to their chief data officers or those that are responsible for their information. They'll say like, yeah, we've got all this information. Is it any good? I think so. Right. And so there's this element of every single organization wants to be data driven, right? If you talk to everybody in any role in any company, they will tell you, I want to be data driven. That's how we make our decisions. And it's true. But I think there is still this massive sense of distrust in data that a lot of executives have, that a lot of people that know kind of where their skeletons are in their closets of their organizations understand. And so I think that's another way of kind of measuring success is, as an executive or as a company, can our decision makers look at the data that we have and say, as they make their decisions, that I truly trust this, and kind of have results to show following a decision that they made on trusted data. And I think we're sort of in the stage where people are getting the data, they're starting to, use it in various ways. Now, many companies are well along in their cloud journey, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a ways to go as well in terms of where they could be. And I'm sure everybody's going to say this is, an everlasting ongoing journey. But I think those are two ways that I would look at it. Can I stand up this revenue generating use case in, a certain amount of time, and can I deliver it to the market? But also from a sentiment standpoint, do I trust my data? And that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day.
So I want to dive into this a little more because I imagine that there are some industries where data migration to the cloud is more prevalent. And I imagine there are some that are more, I'll call them cloud hesitant organizations.
Sure.
And so, what are you seeing across the landscape in terms of what characterizes the kinds of organizations, or is it based off of industries that are more probably use cloud more prevalently versus those that are more hesitant? How would you describe that
Yeah,
landscape?
I mean, Allison, that's a really good question, and I'm really glad you asked. I mean, I think not the mistake that a lot of people make is just thinking that this is all kind of the same, right? Everybody's just trying to move their data to the cloud, but
Mhm.
that couldn't be further from the truth. I think people are moving certain data to the cloud. People are taking advantage of some features, and certain industries are definitely doing it ahead of others. I think, probably the biggest lagging industry, I would say, is financial services from my experience, because they are embracing cloud, but a lot of the contracts that they have are for kind of private cloud. They're managing these environments, or at least have access to an environment that is only accessed by them. And I think they are different in that they're not necessarily looking for a lot of solutions to be kind of cloud native out of the gate. Like if you can have a utility that can move my data that sits within my data center or behind my VPC in a private network, that's perfectly acceptable. Now, I think a lot of these organizations that are a little bit more cloud hesitant are still looking for modern functionality, right? They still want like APIs to control various services. They still want commonalities between these systems, but maybe they just don't want it connected to the internet. And again, this comes down to trust and building trust. I spoke with a financial services customer at an event in Arizona recently, and she was telling me, like, we're not buying cloud solutions for this platform. It's never gonna happen. The cloud's gonna get hacked. It always gets hacked. And then you talk to people, down the street who are also in financial services, and they say, yeah, we're embracing some of these services. So I think it's financial services is definitely the furthest behind, and you're going to see various people, wring their hands of this opportunity of cloud in different ways. In general, they tend to be lagging behind, mainly because they're very focused on information security, on hardening technologies, because they run kind of the global financial system beneath our feet. On the flip side, I think obviously the people who are fastest to embrace the cloud are newer organizations. So regardless of what industry you're in, I think if you are founded more recently, you're not someone that was founded 100 years ago, maybe in the last 10 or 20 years, you're going to find it a lot easier to move your data assets because they're already on more modern technologies. If I were to pick just a general other industry that I would say is a little bit further along, I would say things like retail. We're seeing a lot of retailers embrace cloud to analyze their products and supply chain and sales versus all these other variables that exist. So I think we've seen definitely a major jump in retail when it comes to, all right, let's see how quickly we can stand up these projects. And I think, slightly less, albeit still focused on information security, than financial services, I would say. So I guess those are two examples that I can think of.
If I'm an organization that's more cloud hesitant, either across my business or in a part of my business, um, and at risk of not benefiting from the things that we talked about earlier, what advice would you give in terms of where to start thinking about overcoming that? Like, is there a part of the business, or is there an area, what guidance would you give someone who's kind of facing this challenge right now?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously my response is my response, right? And kind of my thoughts, but there are a lot of organizations today that are looking for a solution that will not only serve their needs now, but also kind of meet their needs in the future. So that means that, if I'm a bank, if I'm very cloud hesitant, I know that at some point there are probably some services that are going to be integrated within the cloud. And so it's nice to work with vendors that don't kind of limit you. So I've worked with some users who have technologies where, well, I need to use this with on-prem data sources, or I can only write to on-prem data sources. And if I want to do something in the cloud, then I have to buy this other kind of license or version. Or there's some kind of contractual, differences between cloud use cases and on-prem use cases. That's a very real thing in the data integration space today. So I would encourage a lot of people that are looking for solutions to look to vendors that provide them in kind of a flexible way, right? Can I get something that is, it's got APIs, it's got, modern containerized deployments, but I can run it in my data center. And then maybe if I'm ready for the cloud, at a certain point, I can hook up what I've already built to a hosted UI or kind of more synergies that exist in a cloud environment. So I guess my advice to those organizations and what we've seen at Precisely and why we tried to craft our products in a certain way is that there are organizations that are going to kind of start in a certain way now, and they're going to grow and evolve. And so we want to make sure we provide them with technology that will meet their needs in these different stages. That's kind of modular and that you can break it up and run it privately, but it also plugs into kind of this broader cloud platform that creates unique value. And I think that's if I'm in financial services or I'm in a cloud hesitant organization, or maybe we're just not ready or we're new to it, that's the type of vendor that I'm looking to work with. So I guess that would be one piece of advice, I guess, from a solution or vendor perspective.
Nice. Now, I want to switch to a different but very important topic. Let's talk about data integrity. So,
sure.
How, when I'm migrating my data, how can organizations ensure that they're really assuring the integrity of their data? It's so important today. Help us understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Historically, there have been all these different solutions that operate on data, right? Obviously, there are data integration solutions that move data from point A to point B. There are, data governance solutions that control the data catalog and tell you who owns that data and who's responsible for it. There are data quality solutions that will improve your data over time. But historically, these have all been kind of separate solutions. And I think what we've seen over the years is that while data governance and data integration and data quality are, separate tool sets historically, they're all really part of the same use case, and that is building trusted data. And so we kind of call this whole process the data integrity process, right? And that includes getting data from all of my different systems to the point where I'm using it potentially in a cloud environment to make decisions. And I trust that data. I can use it for data science projects. I can use it for AI. I know that it's standardized. I know that it's clean. And so I think, at Precisely, we're really driven to provide that unified experience across these different services. And so, I think that's what each of these different roles need, or these organizations need. They don't need just data integration, because I could replicate data from all sorts of databases, but is that data any good, right? Do I have a way to profile it to understand, am I missing something? Does it have the data that I need for, let's say I'm trying to run an email campaign and half of my email addresses are missing from my data, or a mailing campaign and half of my addresses are missing. I think there's some statistic out there that 50% of all data records ever created have some sort of issue or anomaly with them. And so even though we're getting this data, we have to make sure it's usable. We have to understand where it is. We've got to clean it up. And then we need to ensure that it doesn't kind of revert back to its previous state over time once we've tidied it up. And then you get kind of this positive feedback loop of, I'm getting data, I'm understanding what's there, I'm cleaning it, I'm kind of improving it as we go. And now I get it to this kind of gold state, as they call it, or a gold tier where it's usable. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of different components of data integrity. To summarize it, I think it is having trust in your data. And I think that means from a solution process perspective, it's everything from access to understanding who owns it, to fixing issues, to monitoring it, and then potentially adding more data sets to it for additional context. I think one of the things that AI brings up and that we're all kind of driving towards is, how can we get the most quantity of relevant data sets that are accurate and consistent? And that may include all the data that we're generating as a business, but it also includes data that's publicly available, right? Data that exists in the public domain or curated data sets. So not only do you have the data that only you have, but you also have these additional data sets that you can kind of marry together. Now I have more information to kind of draw upon to build my models. So again, kind of a long-winded answer, but it is a complex problem that I think involves a lot of different components. And organizations should be looking for partners in this space that kind of stitch all these things together in a seamless way, because they're all really part of the same problem, which is building trust in your data.
That's beautiful. You gave all of us such a fantastic understanding of the landscape and how to think about it. And a great summary of that too. I want to go even deeper, because
sure, yeah, that's why we're here. This is great.
It's a hot topic, and you've mentioned it a couple of times. And I think that there's so much hunger to really understand especially around data integrity. How do I really make sure that I am prepared to leverage AI? And so I'm hoping, maybe you could highlight or go a little deeper too in terms of like the steps I should be taking and how I should be thinking specifically about preparing for AI right now.
Yeah, so there are a couple different ways to think about AI. I mean, I think there are, I've worked with organizations that have very broad goals for it. Where their executives want to be able to ask all these sort of natural language questions about the business, right? How are products selling today versus yesterday? Compare that to last month, and what was the weather last month, or what events were taking place, and does this relate to any other time in history, and all those kinds of things. So that's very large scale. I think we're seeing a lot of organizations kind of see that as the North Star that they're marching towards. But I think someone mentioned the phrase to me the other day, well, how do you eat an elephant, right? It's bite by bite, one bite at a time. So I think it's about looking at specific projects that you have, not trying to boil this whole ocean of information, but think about where are very meaningful projects where AI could potentially help or make things faster. And then from there, it's about analyzing the data sets. Okay, this is what we want to do. What's the data that exists at our organization that's going to help drive this? And then how can we get that data and make it available and get it in a state where it's clean, it's usable, we verified that it has the information that we need, and now we're off and running using it in our models. The most important thing to remember is that data in this age of AI is still king, right? Whether you're talking about big data, 15 years ago, whether you're talking about the birth of data science and kind of the growth of that over the last decade, AI now, they're all different trends in how we can extract value from data, but it all really depends on the data. So understand the use case that you want to solve, start with something that is clearly definable, that has a measurable impact where you actually think AI is going to make a key difference. And then I think make sure you understand the data sets that you're going to require in order to make that possible. Does
Nice.
that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic guidance. And it also, as you were talking, it was just, the same foundation. Getting this foundation right is so critical. It's always been critical. It's more critical than ever right now. I think you're really bringing that home. So, you've mentioned a couple of times the importance of partnerships. And so I actually want to dive a little bit more into, that challenge of choosing a partner. So can we start with, maybe you could help us understand how partnerships in your mind contribute to being effective with cloud migration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the landscape in which we sit today means that there are a whole host of different interconnected services that are looking for access to data, right? So I might want to use certain dashboards to monitor how my sales are performing, or I want to use a different technology to manage customer complaints or resolutions or things like that. And so there are a lot of different technologies that exist today, and it's impossible for one vendor to be, the best in any of them. There are certain things that we at Precisely never want to attempt to do because we can't do everything, right? And yet there are customers that, in order to get the full value out of a complete business use case, require multiple technologies. And so I think it is critical that you have certain partners that you can work with so that, you can both together deliver value to users across, the end-to-end portion of this life cycle. So I'll give you a very, good example of this. We work with a number of organizations, very, very high volume data replication users. And what we've found, a lot of people want to replicate data directly point to point. So I want to take my mainframe database and replicate it directly to, a Postgres data warehouse running in AWS. What we found actually in a lot of these cases is replicating point to point from one database technology to another is incredibly slow. Especially for very, very high volume customers, it doesn't always work. And so in a lot of these use cases, we've been using a streaming component, which allows data to be written a lot faster. And actually, in this specific example I'm speaking of, we used AWS MSK, or Managed Service for Kafka. And so, we at Precisely are very good at getting data off of systems and replicating it out very quickly. Now, we run into the situation where the target system we're working with is not really fast enough to keep up with the volume. And so we work with AWS and the customer to say, all right, we'll get the data off very quickly, and we'll add this little streaming layer, which AWS, manages and they're an expert in. And then from there, you can consume it. And this architecture is going to allow you to scale very quickly, billions of transactions a day, to a place where you've never been able to, scale before with respect to cloud replication. So that's kind of a more detailed example. But I think the point is there are certain things that we need to do for enterprises to access data at the speed in which they need it. And that often requires multiple components to get the performance that you need. And so this is one example where we need to work with the target vendor, AWS, who's going to be ultimately housing the data to create the right configuration that's going to meet the scale of the customer. So they came to us for one use case. We kind of talked through it and we figured out it was a little bit more complicated and the architecture was a little bit different than the customer had intended originally. But ultimately we delivered value, and now they're capitalizing on a whole host of new AWS solutions with the data that they're bringing from the mainframe. So it's a perfect example of partnership. You have to work with organizations that provide kind of a symbiotic relationship to the use cases that you address. And then, I think everybody's looking to deliver value for the customer, for our users. Everybody wants a good success story. It delivers value for organizations. It makes us feel good as providers. And I think having a partnership is kind of critical to being able to meet the needs of that full end-to-end business use case.
So when you're going through the challenge of evaluating partners, what advice would you give in terms of choosing that partner? You talked about, it sounded like you were talking about sort of alignment between the partner and the organization.
Yeah.
What other factors would is helpful for people to be evaluating or really keeping top of mind as they go through that challenge of selecting?
Yeah. So it's funny. One of my colleagues likes to say, there are a whole host of very fancy state-of-the-art, lasers that they use for surgery these days, and in all kinds of hospitals. But what kind of doctor do you want manipulating that thing? Do you want it to be someone who doesn't really know that much about your underlying body, or do you want somebody that has experience? They've been doing it for years and years, and not only do they have the best tools, but they also have expertise. I think there are a lot of organizations that go around that. Yes, can they meet your point A to point B use case? I guess, to take the data integration example. Can you read data from this source and write it to that target? And maybe they check that box and the answer is yes. But maybe it's a newer technology for them, or maybe they don't have as many customers that are doing it, or maybe, as you start to ask them questions or get feedback on how you should architect it, you're not really getting straightforward answers. And so I think, there are a lot of different ways to think about this and addressing the partner situation. But I think the best thing is look for organizations that have kind of this combination of technology that does meet your needs to a certain extent, but also has expertise, because something will go wrong. In every implementation, with every technology, every integration, something happens. And the software is going to fall short at that point. Everybody can say their software is perfect. They all kind of know everybody runs into something. Every organization is different. And so when that happens, you want to make sure you have the people on the line that understand how to address and respond to problems and help you out when you need it. So, there are a lot of different ways to evaluate partners. It probably depends on how big the project is as to how kind of meticulous you are with the check boxes versus, meeting and working with these partners. But that's really what I would say. If I were to give one piece of advice, I would say you want, the fancy laser that does everything, but you also want the doctor that understands your anatomy and knows how to use it. So that's what I would keep in mind in looking for partnerships, that expertise in addition to software that's going to meet your needs.
Yeah, the doctor example kind of brings it home, doesn't it?
I can't claim originality on that, but I feel like it's good to kind of bring up. It paints a good picture.
It does. I want to connect this to an earlier part of our conversation, because we were talking about data integrity, and I really believe in the importance of that. And so when you're working with a partner, how do you make sure that you're preserving your data integrity, and how do you do that? How do you ensure that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a critical question, and it's one that I get asked very frequently, right? When my data is moving between a number of different technologies, how do I understand that the data has made it? Or how do I understand that my transaction that's taken place has already been propagated? And really it comes down to what I would call, little o observability, right? the ability to kind of monitor and see different hops in the data replication lifecycle to make sure that what was written here actually made it to its ultimate destination. So there are a couple different ways that you can do that. I think from a user perspective, you want to be looking for a solution that has as many statistics as you can possibly get to pull out at different points in replication. So that's record counts, that's byte counts. And I think you want to do that at different steps along that journey. So there are ways that you can monitor and compare different record counts and what's been replicated, but there are also ways that you can monitor the data, right? From a target system, am I getting updates as frequently as I expect? Are there certain anomalies in the data that I'm getting, right? Maybe if I'm financial services and I'm used to getting one currency and all of a sudden I'm getting data from another, can I alert or try to remediate that before whoever's looking at that data in a dashboard actually has to deal with it? So I think, being able to work with vendors and solutions that have elements of observability built into them, being able to see, all right, where is my data? What are the statistics at this point versus another point? Another big thing, if I'm delivering a service, is latency. So I'll kind of add that in there. Are there additional latency statistics in addition to record counts and volumes and data that I can monitor? And so there's no kind of, silver bullet or push button solution, tell me my data has integrity, but it's sort of all of these different metrics and statistics that you use together and build up over time so you can understand your history to kind of, make that decision or determination. Is my data pipeline up and running, not only up and running, but is the data as I expect it? And can I monitor that and ensure its longevity and et cetera, et cetera?
And so Precisely has also done some work on data integrity with the Laboe College of Business, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think what we try to do is basically get as much feedback as we can from organizations in general. And this is kind of getting back to the comment that I made earlier. How do you ensure, how do you prove or how do you validate trusted data? Like, how do I prove data integrity? I think was the question that you asked. And I think from our work in that research study, we just found that a lot of organizations did not trust their data. They wanted to be more data driven, but they didn't really have faith in the data that they were making decisions on. And so, there are a couple different findings, but I think that was probably the most prominent of it is that, C-suite wants to be data driven. They want to be able to do things like ask natural language questions about their business. But there's still this distrust in data. And I think a lot of that comes from having the right data, having data quality, and understanding kind of who owns it and what the data actually entails. There are a lot of people out there that don't really know all of the data sets that they have. So that's a whole other problem.
Okay. Yeah. So, we've been talking a lot about the imperative of these shifts, and you mentioned earlier the economic environment. So I want to also make sure before we end that we get a chance to talk about cost a little bit more. You've mentioned it, but I'm really curious how you think about the cost landscape changing with data migration to the cloud, and how do organizations plan for new costs and operating models in cloud environments, or how do the costs change, and what kind of advice can you give on that in terms of how to plan for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really critical question. And there are a couple of different ways that I would approach it. I mean, I think I'll start off just by telling you kind of a general story that I've experienced. We were working with one customer that was relatively new to their cloud environment. So they were looking to integrate, actually it was an iSeries database in their data center with their cloud environment. And they had projected over the next 3 years that they were going to be onboarding a whole host of different systems. And it was going to be this, very, very quick accelerated move to cloud. But as we started to get our replication use case off the ground, and they started to get the data into the cloud and kind of work with it, they realized that they were running a whole host of different merge queries in the cloud database that was actually increasing their CPU and their spend and their bill from their cloud provider. And the cost model that they were using for that wasn't really built for the volume that they were replicating. So they kind of got this sticker shock from their cloud provider, and we had to have kind of a whole meeting between everybody that was involved in the project to figure out what we could do. And ultimately, they negotiated kind of a different cost model with the cloud provider. But it's very important when you start off any of these projects to understand, how is the vendor or the technology that I'm using going to charge me, right? For years, if I've been running a workload on premises in my data center, I own this Linux server or this mainframe where this workload is running. All of a sudden, if I move that to the cloud, right, I'm not paying for heating and cooling costs, but I'm paying for CPU usage that I have on that system. So that's a very basic example. I think, a lot of you understand this, but you really need to kind of keep in mind, how does my data flow today? What's every single step in this process? Like, what's every IO? What am I reading? Where is the data moving? What's the protocol? When it passes through this system, is it in memory or is it being written somewhere? Think about every single step that your data takes on its way to wherever it might be going, and understand how cost factors into that. So it sounds kind of basic, right? Understand what you're doing and have a plan, but understand how your cost model factors into it today. But also, if this project is going to grow or you're going to build on this use case, how is it going to factor in tomorrow? Is this cost model that saved you money maybe in the short term going to grow exponentially so that your next project is going to cost twice as much? You need to think about where you are today, but also where you want to be. So I guess that would be kind of my primary advice: is understand your cost model, understand what the technology you're using is going to charge you and how they're going to charge you. Look at what you're doing today or what you want to build, and understand kind of every piece of that. And that will help you keep your costs, a lot tighter, and your workload a lot tighter from a spend perspective, because there are no secrets, right? You understand what you're trying to do. You understand where the pitfalls are in terms of cost. And hopefully you can evaluate these things up front. So yeah, understand the cost model, understand what you're trying to do, and then, really, really go through it with a fine-tooth comb so that there are no surprises in, oh, I'm actually running this particular query and that's driving up CPU, or things of that nature. That's a very basic kind of set of advice that I would give, and one specific example where it was a big problem for the customer and definitely put the project at risk.
Well, I think what's also interesting about what you said is how you're matching us to strategic vision and where you're going. And so I think that's maybe a connection piece that's often missed. And so to do it with that rigor, I think is incredible advice.
It's good to have a plan.
Yes, exactly. We are just about out of time, but I have to ask you one last question. This is a challenging moment right now for leaders. And so I'm curious if you were to give a piece of advice for the listeners to take into their next couple of weeks and months as they think about data migration to the cloud. What are some the last piece of advice that you'd love to give to our listeners on this call in terms of a best practice or a first step or a thing to really bring with them into their
yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, I think what I would say is, with any of these projects, really try to understand your strengths, and know where you need help, right? Mm-hmm. So the folks that work on your team, the folks that are sitting in a room, literally or virtually, they're helping you kind of manage this project. So, as you start to kind of plan out what you want to do, try to get a sense from them and their corresponding engineers and the broader team. What do we know how to do? What do we feel comfortable with? What do we need help with? And I think all of this really helps you, at the end of the day, reach your goal faster and reduce the spend and churn that you might be putting up trying to bring these projects to market. Know your strengths, understand where you need help, feel empowered to engage with strategic vendors or partners that have that knowledge and software to get you where you're going. And so the most successful organizations are the ones that kind of raise the level of the talent that they have, but also understand what they don't know. They don't struggle with what they don't know, and they kind of bring in expertise. So I think that's really critical to understanding what you need for a project. That might change on a project by project basis, but as you go through each kind of iteration of, I'm moving this application to the cloud, now it's the next application, you'll get better at understanding what those are and what you're good at and where you've fallen short and where you need help. So understand what you can do, what you know, don't struggle with what you don't know, and engage with partners. Before you pay them any money, make sure they have the expertise and they can show you some value before moving forward, right? And that way you have skills on your team, you're engaging with vendors are valuable not only for their software, but for their expertise. And all of that together will help you create, more success in these use cases.
Well, those are wonderful words of wisdom to end with. So I want to give a shout of thanks to Precisely for making this conversation today possible. I want to thank everyone that listened in today. And John, I especially want to thank you for sharing your perspective and your insights with us.
Yeah, Allison, it's really been a pleasure to be on with you, and certainly thank you all for listening. Hopefully, was able to provide something that was valuable or something to kind of rattle around inside your brain.
Thank you so much.